What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of At a Glance, the series in which I give you an appetizer sampler glimpse into a particular faction in 40k, and the goal is to help you decide if you want to look further into that faction on your own, or maybe even start collecting that force. So by viewer request, on the chopping block this time is a Renegade Space Marine chapter that at its core remains loyal to the Emperor of Mankind, but not the corrupt imperial institution of the Imperium, and does what it can to fight for the Emperor of Mankind himself. That is the Soul Drinkers Renegade Space Marine chapter. Now, the Soul Drinkers is the chapter that I like the look of visually, but I find kind of silly personally with some of the stuff that goes on. But they're an interesting chapter because they are a successor chapter. They are a successor chapter with a whole novel series devoted to them. And it's this novel series that gives us the fluff and the lore of this chapter and its renegade status, all the way to the bitter end where they are destroyed as a chapter. So yes, this chapter, in terms of the Imperial timeline, you could say no longer exists as a fighting force. It's extinct. But you may still have an interest in collecting them. Some people do, some people won't, because of the fact that they're destroyed. That alone will turn some people away. But this is a Space Marine chapter that started off loyal, had some things happen, and walk the path of the Renegade while staying loyal to the Imperium instead of going full-on Chaos Space Marines, even though some of their members did and they had to fight against that. So, firstly, this chapter was thought originally to be an Imperial Fist successor by everybody, essentially. The Soul Drinkers, the Imperial Fists, it was all thought that they were an Imperial Fist successor chapter. Later on in the novel series, it comes to light that they actually aren't an Imperial Fist successor. We don't really learn who they are a successor of, just that they're not an Imperial Fist successor. Which I found a little bit kind of silly. Why do that? But that's just my opinion there. But that's how it came to light towards the end of their chapter's life, actually, when they were on trial. But we'll get to that in a moment. So we really only have fluff on them in terms of what the novels tell us. And what the novels tell us is they were excommunicated because of an incident with the Mechanicum in which they destroyed a Mechanicum Starfort. They were trying to get an artifact back called the Soul Spear. The Mechanicum wanted to keep it, reverse engineer it, do stuff like that, and the Soul Drinkers weren't having any of that. So conflict erupted, and they ended up destroying the Starfort. It was a strike force led by Sarpedon, a librarian. So they link up with the rest of the chapter fleet, and instead of doing what the Inquisition suggested, the Soul Drinkers did not follow the Inquisition's protocol and suggestion. The chapter master instead handled it in-house, or tried to. So the Inquisition was there, present in terms of their fleet was there, but they weren't like in front of each other or anything like that. And this is when Sarpedon was called to duel to the death the chapter master. This is how the chapter master was going to handle it in-house. The Soul Drinkers judged themselves, essentially. And if his purpose was true and pure, he would win the duel, type of deal. And this is when Tzeentch, the Chaos God, tips his hand and mutates Sarpedon and mutates some of the other members of the chapter, trying to turn them into a Chaos pawn for whatever reason. And Sarpedon, lower half, becomes a arachnid type of lower half. He has 8 legs, 8 arachnid legs, burst forth from his body, and with this mutation and newfound strength, he rips apart the chapter master. So then the chapter has a civil war right on the spot, essentially, because Sarpedon claims the mantle of chapter master and leader of the chapter, although some of those don't approve, and then there are those that say he's basically, there were forces in the chapter that thought Sarpedon was corrupted because of, well, the obvious, and then there were members who thought he was uncorrupted, even though the obvious. And it ended with a bloody conflict within the chapter that saw Sarpedon take control of the chapter. And then they flee from the fleet of the Inquisition and everything, and become a Renegade chapter full on. So it's during this time that they actually learn the true origins of their mutations and then fight against it essentially. And while Sarpedon stays mutated, he doesn't fall to chaos as Tzeentch had planned. He fights against chaos. He fights for the Emperor, who he and the Soul Drinkers are steadfastly loyal to, even though they view the Imperium as a corrupt institution. So that's what they do. And it's during this time that they have numerous conflicts, both within and with Imperial forces, as well as Xenos and Demon and Chaos forces. So they have a second kind of chapter of Civil War that happens. They fight against demonic forces. They fight against some Crimson Fist and Howling Griffin forces in conflict. They fight against Xenos. And all the while, the numbers, even though they're trying to replenish the numbers are dwindling because they're unsupported and alone in the galaxy, essentially. So it's during this time that they get to the lowest numbers, which is around 100 Space Marines strong or so, around a company strong. And this was in the aftermath of fighting against Necrons, and this is when the Imperial Fists capture them for trial. They track them down, and they capture them because, remember, at this point, everybody thinks they're still an Imperial Fist successor, and therefore the Imperial Fists want them on trial. They want to handle the Soul Drinkers honorably. And it's during this trial that it comes to light that they're not Imperial Fist successors at all. And it's during this trial that a massive demonic incursion happens. A traitor member of the Soul Drinkers and the Demon Prince of Braxis basically lead a demonic incursion onto the Phalanx. And battle ensues. So the Soul Drinkers are permitted to defend the Phalanx, and most of their number die in the process. In the aftermath of the battle, the few remaining Soul Drinkers, a handful of them, walk through a warp gate, effectively never seen or heard from again, effectively self-imposed exile to voluntary being lost in the warp is what happens to the remaining Soul Drinkers, the handful of them. And their ultimate fate remains unknown. But considering even if that didn't happen, there's only 4 or 5 of the Soul Drinkers left, the chapter was effectively extinct and destroyed, wiped out. And that's basically how the story ends with the Soul Drinkers. So I really kind of just skipped on the top of the surface of their novel series. It was a quick down and dirty approach to giving you a real quick glimpse into what's going on with the Soul Drinkers chapter. So if you don't mind the idea of having a half spidery librarian chapter leader leading a renegade force of Space Marines that has fought against literally everything, including themselves, and you like the way the chapter looks color scheme wise, I recommend, if you haven't done so already, picking up the Soul Drinkers novel series and reading it and getting inspiration for how you want to collect them yourself if that's something you want to do. For me personally, the Soul Drinkers, while interesting, it's just not my cup of tea. I find the whole half spider, or at least 8 arachnid leg Sarpedon thing silly. That's the biggest problem I have with it. And I also find it kind of silly that he's a librarian and didn't even realize. Yes, I know it was Tzeentch, but you think having raw chaos exposure to mutate you would kind of flip a switch in a librarian's brain to recognize something, but what do I know, right? It's a case of it's for the novel series, right? Like the Soul Drinkers are a Space Marine chapter that really is hard to represent on the tabletop in the way that they're represented in the novel series. So with that said, their color scheme I really like a lot. It's purple armored, gold trim, bone trim, and silver trim. That's kind of their accent colors, is gold, bone, and silver on their purple armor. It's a very regal, very noble color scheme. I think it reflects very well the purity of purpose in the Soul Drinker chapter's core, how they're still loyal to the Emperor to the very end. I think their color scheme represents that pretty well. And it looks very nice. I like it, but it is purple. It is kind of a specific look you have to like. So that, combined with their fluff and lore, is going to really help make or break a chapter for a lot of people. But I like the look. Now, I recommend the Space Marine Codex for them. Yeah, the Chaos Space Marine Codex might give you some leeway in terms of representing this Renegade chapter that has had Chaos mutations within them, even though it was unwanted. So you could definitely make use of the Chaos Codex. I just find the Space Marine Codex works better. They're still loyal to the Emperor of Mankind himself, and they fight in their own way. So I find the Space Marine Codex can still represent them pretty well. But I guess my end point is either codex can work. What chapter tactic you go with is up to you. If you want to do something in line with their fluff, I recommend the Imperial Fist chapter tactics, because even though they're not actually Imperial Fist successors, they fought for their entire chapter's existence as if they were. So they adopted, or you could say they adapted to or adopted that way of fighting and mentality of fighting. So I would say that that would be a good chapter tactic to go with, but because they're technically not Imperial Fist successors, whatever chapter tactic that floats your boat can work here. Now, as far as representing Sarpedon in model form, you don't have to, but he is the main character of the story, you could say, and as the chapter gets smaller and smaller and smaller, it would make sense that he would be increasingly seen fighting every battle that the chapter is fighting. So you would have to represent him in his 8-legged glory. One of his legs is bionic, by the way. And in doing so, I would recommend fielding him as a librarian on a bike. He's going to stand out and look different to begin with. At least have it work for you a little bit, and make him count as being on a bike. I think that would be pretty cool, actually. So that's my suggestion there. If you're going to do Sarpedon as your HQ, you're probably going to want to pick up some Tyranid bits, by bid ordering from where you can. And if you're going to do that, I recommend bid ordering the chalice / goblet looking stuff in terms of armor, in terms of shoulder pads and whatnot from the Blood Angels. Anything with a chalice on it can be very useful for representing your force, in terms of having it as a shoulder pad or whatever it is on your model to help get the point across, because the chapter symbol is a laurel with a goblet at the center of it, or a chalice, whatever you want to call it, and has some soul energy coming out of it. So that's their symbol, which can be a bit difficult to freehand. So anything that has a chalice on it already can help you out with that. And other than that, there's not too much else to say with the Soul Drinkers. It's really a case of read their story if you have an interest based on what I said, because I'll get really bogged down in trying to explain things, and I'll just make it sound silly. But the author is what makes it sound interesting. I've only read the first novel. I don't know if I read the second one, but I definitely read the first one for the Soul Drinkers, and I can tell you it's an interesting read as long as you can get past the whole 8-legged librarian chapter leader thing. But anyways, that's the Soul Drinker Space Marine chapter, a chapter that thought it was an Imperial Fist successor, turns out it wasn't, and to the very end remained loyal to the Emperor of Mankind himself, if not the corrupt institution that sprouted up around him, which I find a very interesting concept for a Renegade chapter. And because their entire novel series focuses on them being this Renegade chapter, they're kind of the poster chapter for a loyalist Renegade chapter because of that fact. This is often a chapter, if you know about it, this is kind of like the first thing that pops into your mind when you think Renegade, loyal, Space Marine chapter. Anyways, that's it for the Soul Drinker, so thanks for sticking through it. Hopefully this has helped some of you who maybe didn't really know too much about them beforehand. I didn't want to get, like I said, bogged down in going over all of the details that are within the novel series. So thanks for sticking through it. If you have any questions or comments or any requests for an at-a-glance faction, feel free to leave it in the comment section. And until next time, take it easy.